So we start all of our events with a land acknowledgement. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous peoples, settlers, all newcomers have been invited in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. For folks who might not know, Toronto comes from the Mohawk word Toronto, which means where the land meets the water, which refers to the abundant area that was here before colonization. The dish or the bowl refers to the land that was plentiful, and the spoon represents the folks who were sharing the land with common purpose and understandings. And the reason it's a spoon and not a knife or a fork is to represent kind of that spirit of peace and understanding. Then that's some kind of information about where I am today and one of the treaties for the land that I'm on, but I know that we're not all joining from the same space online, so please take the time to look up information about the land that you're on by going to www.native-land.ca. Thank you so much to Carol, our amazing VP Finance and Services with CESAR. CESAR is a students' union representing part-time students and continuing education students at Ryerson with 16,000 student members. And we are proud to offer services, campaigns, and advocacy support for our students, as well as a host of online events such as this one. So thank you so much, Carol, for organizing this amazing event. And thank you so much, Kike, as well. Kike is the Unifor Chair in Social Justice and Democracy at Ryerson for organizing this amazing conversation.
Thank you so much, Maddie. I'm really happy to be here again with CESAR and thank the whole CESAR team for today's conversation that we're really looking forward to. We have two amazing guests with us, Dr. Jill Andrew and Hawa Mire. And we're looking forward to a conversation about taking action. How can we get involved to make positive change in our communities? So just a quick introduction. Although I think many people will know our speakers as they've shared their time and insights and knowledge with us at Ryerson on previous occasions. Dr. Jill Andrew is a member of Provincial Parliament for Toronto St. Paul's, having been elected in 2018. She's the culture and heritage critic, as well as the women's issue critic for the official opposition. And she also is a co-founder of the Ontario NDP Black Caucus, which is a first of its kind in the province. She has hosted several initiatives, including culture and arts deputations, the creation of ad hoc arts and culture advisory councils. She's been on a whirlwind listening tour around women's issues. She's helped establish Ontario's first Eating Disorders Awareness Week. She works very hard on a whole range of issues around housing, education, healthcare, gender equity, and so on. But she's been particularly fighting back around funding cuts to vital services such as libraries and funds like the Ontario Music Fund and the Ontario Arts Council, and fighting for paid sick days and so many other things. But outside of politics, Jill is also a co-founder of Body Confidence Canada. She's an award-winning educator in equity and human rights and body image advocate. And she's also the co-editor of a new anthology called Body Stories, In and Out and With and Through Fat, which was just published by Demeter Press, as well as being a community co-owner of Glad Day Bookshop, which is the world's oldest LGBT bookstore. So welcome, Dr. Jill Andrew. And also joining us is another powerhouse, Hawa Mire, who is an equity consultant and a community organizer, and she has been working for over 20 years with nonprofit organizations focused on inclusive community development all across Ontario and Canada. Hawa's family came to Canada from Somalia, and she grew up in York, Southwestern, where she encountered a lot of different issues, where she helped build the strength and determination of the community to fight for a more just and equitable world. She has a master's degree in environmental studies from York University, and people know Hawa as a frequent commentator and columnist whose work has appeared in all kinds of media publications such as Maclean's, Metro Morning, CBC, City TV, Rabble, and other places. And she uses her platform to advance issues that matter to struggling communities. She's been inspired by the strength and wisdom of the elders around her as well to fight on issues around inequality and poverty. And throughout her career, she's always stood up on a range of different issues, including also housing, employment, youth empowerment, and community development. So we're really happy to have Hawa here joining us as well. Welcome to both of you. So I'm going to turn it over to our VP at CESAR, Carol, to begin diving into the discussion with some questions for you.
So thank you both, Jill and Hawa, for being part of this conversation this afternoon. And after listening to your incredible bio and the work that you do in the community, my question to both of you is, how and why did you personally get involved in organizing around politics, involved in politics and organizing? So what was your personal drive that get you to decided to say, okay, you know what, I want to politics and to organize? I'll start with Jill. Sorry.
Well, the decision's been made for me.
Yes.
Thank you, Carol. I was sort of thinking, which way do I go? How do I respond? And one of the first things that came to my mind, so I'll just sort of stick with that, was a book I read when I was around 12. And it was called Silenced by Makeda Silvera. And it told the stories of domestic workers, who had come to Canada, who had, in many cases, left by no choice their families at home, hoping to, find community here, hoping to find work here, hoping to find status here, and instead, in many cases, finding gender-based violence, racism, harassment, rape, sexual assault, enshrined poverty, you name it. That book, and it's funny because I got that book in a church basement. You know how some churches would have those bazaars and you could get like an old necklace or this, that. I got that book there for maybe 10 cents.
Wow.
Big time, right? And that book for me was the start with regards to my passion and my interest to delve into women's lives, to delve into, Black lives, our lives, and to really try to make the connections that I could. As young as that age, I had family members who were domestic workers. I still do, my mother had also worked as a domestic worker for a time. So this was a very intriguing thing for me to read a book that documented, that chronicled the lives of these women in their voices. You know what I mean? For me, how I begun organizing. Well, it's interesting. I don't go around calling myself an organizer. I think what I would call myself, which is the fact, is I'm simply someone who cares about certain issues and will jump into those issues where I can. And for me, the issues that matter most are the ones that I have lived through. The ones that I have experienced. When people sit and say, well, why do you care about size discrimination, or why do you have an anthology on fat politics, or why do you speak out and say that you're a Black, fat, queer woman sitting in Queen's Park? It's because of the verbal attack I had when I was 15, 16 years old on public transit, where a white man and his dog, he thought his dog had a right to a seat, more so than I did. And I love animals, you know what I mean? And he went on to verbally attack me, with racist epithets, with size epithets, it was just, and no one really did anything. Everyone sort of looked and turned away, literally. And in some cases, people laughed. And there I was, a kid on public transit, ironically heading to Tropicana. When we talk about organizing, again, I don't know that I would refer to myself as an organizer in that sense, but I have certainly benefited from community organizations that helped me see the power in galvanizing, in mobilizing, in being amongst people who looked like me, who had similar lived experiences, who were willing to speak out on some of the issues that I was dealing with, and still that we are dealing with in the 21st century, that I was dealing with at 14, whether it was racism in schools, and I'm thinking about, our leaders back in the day at Tropicana, like Eleanor Edwards, I'm thinking about how people like that would give us the language we needed to be able to confront our teachers, challenge them, when we saw curriculum that didn't reflect us, to challenge them, when we asked to host Black History Month events and we were told, oh, well, we can do a basketball 3-on-3, and I'm not, ragging, of course, on education, because I love education, that is my heart, but what we have to always remember is, even in a space where, there are such good educators and there's such good momentum and intention, because of how salient institutionalized racism and sexism is, it's there. Even with the good ones, even with the good educators, the good professors, the good administrations, the good deans, the pervasiveness of racism and sexism exists, So for me, organizing begins with the lived experience. It begins with what rests most saliently in your heart. It begins with what wakes you up in the morning. It begins with what you're passionate about, what you would care about for free, what you would fight for, what you'd be willing to give up, parts of yourself for. And for me, that has always been the empowerment of Black women, of women and girls, of communities that have been on the margin, as best as I can. And I'm still learning, and I'm still a work in progress. Yeah.
Thank you for that. It's easy when we talk about, we are organizers, but it's such a passion. We have to go with our lived experience. Thank you. I'm so glad that you were able to go to that basement in that church and get that book that shaped you, and really see what we could, your contribution towards our community. Thank you so much on that book and on you. And Hawa, I just want to ask you this question. Also, what personally get you involved in politics and organizing?
Thanks, Carol, and thank you, Jill, and thank you, Kike. I wanted to say, I met Jill years ago at a fundraiser, and we were cracking jokes in the back while everyone else was figuring out what to fundraise in the front. And I remember you sharing the genesis of the book, and I remember hearing it then. And so for me to get a chance to talk to you, to know that book is on shelves and people are purchasing it, just like it, for me, is such a great example of organizing. Is that it's the seed to fruition, right? That's, I think, how I've always thought about organizing, how I've always valued the organizing that's done by the people around me that I've had the opportunity to learn from. I was not a very typical child, right? I was a child of refugees. I came into this country and I went to a school with a bunch of other children who didn't look like me. And so one of the ways that I felt like I could be seen was to organize around other people to get conditions that worked for me. So there's this image of me in the Vancouver Sun at 5 years old where all the kids are facing one way, and the photographer, I remember this at 5, and the photographer says, you have to face the same direction as all the other kids. This is the first day of school photo. And I said, no, and I faced in the other direction. So there's this photo of like 20 kids facing to the left and Hawa facing to the right. And for no other reason than I was just uncomfortable. I was holding my lunch bag in one hand and my bag in another, and the direction he wanted me to turn in was uncomfortable for me, and I didn't want to do it because it didn't feel good. And so I remember that image, and I remember many more. I was also a child that wasn't the same size as other children, and children's washrooms in elementary school didn't fit me. And so I wanted to use the teacher's washroom. And the only way to do that at that age was to get the key to use that washroom. And you had to get special permission and all of these things. And at some point figured out how to get the key, get permission, and use a different washroom. And then I started taking other children who were like, we want to use that washroom too. I said, well, I know where the key is and I know how we can get in. So let's do it. Like we can all use this new place, this new tool that I found. And, you know, it seems like such a small example, but I think that's been the desire and the driving force for me for so long is, how can I change the conditions that other people think are normal for me and people who look like me? And how can I use all of the things at my disposal to do that? And so I think when I think about I think about most of my life has been characterized by that. I wouldn't have called myself an organizer. Actually, I wouldn't have necessarily said it was organizing, but I would have said it was about getting the right tools and resources to people who just either didn't know how to use those tools or resources or didn't even know that they were there to be used. And if I could figure it out, then I could also make sure that others would have a pathway where maybe I didn't have one or others didn't have one. So that's probably my impetus. I think particularly as growing up as a Black woman in this country, you don't often choose where you end up. You just kind of trip into things. And so I don't think I ever chose to be in a leadership position in the ways that I chose. No one else wanted to do it. So I couldn't see people who looked like me. I kind of fell into it. I learned it as I went. I saw others who were doing it pretty good, and I learned from them as I moved along. So some of it's also quite accidental, but I felt a desire to be in service. I've always felt a desire to be in service. And so jumped into the spaces that were offered.
Is it possible, Carol, for me to say something quickly?
Yes, definitely.
To what Hawa said about people not even knowing the tools are there for them to access them. You know, this is something that resonates so powerfully. You know, I'm thinking of secondary school and, you know, my work as a child and youth worker or as an equity advisor, whatnot. That is something that we used to find such great pride in informing parents, informing students, even more importantly, so that they could have their student voice, you know, about the role of a trustee, you know, about the role of a superintendent, you know, about the role of a centrally assigned principal, so that kids could know that there was a path to resistance. Like there was a way of engaging, and that the buck didn't stop with that teacher who summed you up the minute you walked into the class, or who had the pleasure, quote unquote, of having your sibling or your cousin the year before, who maybe didn't work out well with that one, and placed judgment from that experience onto yourself. So I just wanted to say that is powerful, because that's what it's about, is sharing tools, and that some may call organizing. But I also just think of it as sharing tools, you know, sharing the tools we need to navigate the systems that are built in exactly the way the systems want to be built to keep us out, or to keep us stuck in a hole wondering how to get out because there's 10 exits. You know? Yeah.
I really like how you share, how you talk about, I get a key, but I wanted to share that key with other students. You know, and that is what community is all about. We come from a place of compassion, a place of love, that if it works for me, why we can't share it with others. And that when we talk about we fall into spaces and and it just leadership just come to you, it really is. Most of the time, we end up taking up the walks and doing this leadership because we just have to do it. It come from a place of love. It come from a place of who else is going to do it for us? And that really lead me into the second question. And I really thank you, Jill, and thank you, Mama. Just feel free to just, have this conversation because this is organic as possible. It's a conversation. And the second question is what particular people, mentors, leaders, events that stand out, that influences, that shaped you as individuals?
Jeez. Oh, I didn't realize I wasn't on mute there. Oh my goodness, I think I can think back as far as, the Dominican Association cultural events that my mother would take me to. My mother's Dominican, raised significantly in Trinidad, but born in Dominica. I think about the cultural association events we would go to. Whether you were learning about arts, heritage, a little bit of politics, seeing family, seeing extended community, I think about higher marks, and being tutored by someone who may have looked like you, what I mean? Someone who had not only an academic interest in your well-being, but an interest in your social and emotional health, I think about hanging out at Maskell's with my mother, And again, it's like back then you're like, oh my gosh, I have to come to Honest Ed's. And then from Honest Ed's, it's this, because you have all these plans as a kid, right? Of course. But looking back at those moments, and then of course, traveling forward all these years to like 14 or 15, I'm thinking about, Mike Brown, and I'm thinking about the action that Black Lives Matter took, outside of the US consulate, if I'm not mistaken, There is such a power when you are in the presence of community. There's a power when you're in the presence of Black folks who are sincerely invested in your well-being. You know what I mean? Who are invested in ensuring that you have a sense of your culture, your sense, a right to use your voice. And that is unparalleled. That is an unparalleled feeling. So whenever I have to ask myself, whenever I have to look back on memories or look back at how I've engaged in community or how I felt, safe or secure or enveloped by community, whether it was the arts, whether it was a hair shop, whether it was Monica's, whether it was a cultural association, whether it was a book launch, a reading, or whether it was a rally, there was just something powerful about being amongst community, all fighting for the same thing, or at least for similar things from different entry points. I kind of rambled there. I'm sorry.
No, I think there's a lot of relationship for me too, right? I immediately, what comes to mind is elders in my community, people that have taken care of me, people who have loved me, who have pushed me, and taken care of is also like, that was a really ridiculous mistake. We don't talk to people like that, go back and apologize, right? Also people who corrected me when I wasn't always moving in ways that maybe I move differently now, but as a teenager, as a young person. And I can also, what I would say is everybody who took a risk on me, like every person who thought, maybe let's support her and see what happens. So I'd say the people who have been my strongest support, strongest mentors are people who have given me access to something, taken time to walk me through the steps of it, taken risks when they weren't sure what the cost or consequence might have been for them, right? A friend who worked at a place that convinced the boss to hire me, and was like, don't make a mistake, don't mess it up, I could get fired too, right? So people who've taken a risk in trying to pull me in and on board, I would say have been really strong people for me. And also people who are fearless. Like, you know, I come from, you know, my family comes from Somalia. If you've ever met, you know, a group of Somali matriarchs, oh goodness, like there is no fear. It's like dive in full force. And so that sense of like fearlessness, like what's gonna stop us anyway? Like what's happening to us, it's so bad. We already know the worst outcome of what could happen. So what's a little pressure? It's not going to hurt anybody to jump in and tell them what we want to do. So that sense of like fearlessness, what's the worst that's going to happen? We've already imagined the worst that's going to happen. Would it, you know, do we want to not try or not put something on the table that could change it for everybody? I think sticks with me. I was also named for my grandmother. You know, she had a lot of grandchildren, and I was one of two that was named for her. I was the first that was named for her. And so I have a very strong sense of affinity and connection to her before she passed. And one of the things that she taught me a lot about what I know about community building, about relationships, about the importance of keeping people involved every step of the way, around integrity, and about the principle of the thing. This thing she kept always saying, right? It's about the principle of the thing. It's not like there's no shortcuts. It doesn't matter if it's right or wrong. Like, does it mean something? Do it. Does it not mean something? Don't do it. Is it going to hurt somebody? Don't do it. It doesn't matter if it puts some extra money in your pocket or makes you feel good for 10 seconds. Like, it's about the principle of it. You know, we don't want to harm people while we're walking through. And so that resonates also for me. And, you know, I always talk about a story. I was a really terrible high schooler. I say terrible and I laugh because I work with young people, right? Like I was the one in the back of the room. I just made that comment, right? In the back of the room, cracking jokes, causing a bit of a ruckus. And I had lots of teachers who just declared me a troublemaker. But I had one particular mentor who asked me to come up and teach the class. And I think that was a very transformative experience for me because what she saw was leadership. If I could move everyone's attention from her to the back of the class, then likely I could move it all back to the front of the class as well. And she saw that in this very interesting way. And that, I think, because she saw it, I saw it too. Right. And so that also, I think, has been, I always think about that moment and I use it all the time in my work when I think about somebody heckling you or saying something. What am I missing? How can I redirect them so they see something new in themselves about their ability to lead or step up or do something different?
Yes.
You know, it's so beautiful when we could draw on these examples. We could draw on our mother, you know, going into these communities. Like how Jill said, you know, my mom in Dominica, you talk about a teacher, I seen you. You know, I see you come up to the front of the class. Families, your grandparents, you know, our community is so much involved. It really shapes us as who we are as women, and you know, and this acknowledgement is so important to every one of us, and it lead me into this question around. I know you touch a lot. I know both of you all have kind of touched on what influenced you and the mentors. But I have this question. What are some of the recent examples of people organizing and inspiring you? And what have those people accomplished? Because this is something that we want to move our students to that kind of direction.
Are you starting with me again, Carol?
Yes.
Well, you know, the first thing I want to say as well, you know, when I became a politician, you know, I got elected, there was this assumption that, you know, I had been organizing all the time. I was connected to a million community, you know, actions. I knew every organization. I had been at Queen's Park 50 times, 100 times before with a sign. a lot of that wasn't the case, you know. My mother as well, you know, my biggest activist, because when you got to work many shifts, when you got to come to your school and show up for your kids, when you have to show up in the ER, when you got to show up, you know, and get them the basics so they can go and put their best foot forward, that to me is the biggest activism you can do. I say all of that to say this, you know, being able to join every action, to show up, to do 100 things a week, there's also privilege in that. And I say that so that students know that they can enter activism wherever they are at. There's no gold star, there's no cool activist title. You can start wherever you're at, whether that's picking up the phone and checking on an individual in community, whether it's making a sign that you put in your window, not even necessarily on the streets, or if it is taken to the streets, you know? So I just want to put that out there so that folks know that there is no right or a wrong way to get involved. And can you remind me, Carol, of the first beginning of the question again? Sorry.
The first beginning was example of recent people organizing. Yes.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
You know, I touched on Black Lives Matter before, but here's what I want to say, you know, because when I sit with my friends and we deconstructed, you know, the George Floyd case, or we sat and, you know, counseled each other and supported each other, you know, through the case with Andre Campbell, you know, Regis Korchenski-Parkett, people who were looking for support and ended up dead, looking for support from police and ended up dead. Let me just be explicit about that, right? The courage, the tenacity, the boldness that Black Lives Matters has demonstrated, their ability to shut down Pride Toronto those years back, to put forth their demands. I can be honest, at 16, I may not have been able to do that. At 21, I might not have been able to do that. So there's just something to be said about this generation. And of course, I have to tip my hat off to the elders, because Black Lives Matter didn't just spring out of nowhere. Yes. We have had griots here. We have had rebel rousers. We have had, you know, our activists, our Black leaders here for time immemorial, right? But there's something to be said about Black folks, queer Black folks, trans Black folks, Black women, you know, who have led this movement and who have been unapologetic about it, you know, who have been unapologetic about calling out police, you know, have been unapologetic about demanding that police be defunded so that funding can go to community, to the resources that actually work, that are culturally relevant, that have research behind them, you know, calling out, you know, the lack of transparency in the SIU, for instance, you know, calling out the systemic discrimination that Black youth still face in schools today, you know, calling out the lack of curriculum that's reflective of us, you know, calling out the disrepair, quite frankly, of Toronto community housing, you know, all of the various social, cultural, economic crises and how they disproportionately impact us as Black folks. And I have to say this, you know, calling out that even during a pandemic, you know, where all of our Black lives should matter, we have seen that lives that are caught up in the carceral system, lives that are incarcerated, lives that are behind bars, quote unquote, you know, have all but been forgotten in many ways. And not just with COVID-19, but in general. So for me, I mean, I can't list every one of their accomplishments, but what I know is that they have created a national and international dialogue that will not be stopped. And it will not only be actions. You know, this is a platform here. This is a platform that's going to take us in to the next many years, you know. Yes. And I for one, I'm very grateful for that. Very, very grateful for that. That inspires me. That keeps me on my feet and gets me motivated when I feel scared, when I feel nervous, you know, when all the self-criticism creeps into our minds, as it does all of us. When you can look and see a movement that has grown from community that looks like us, that is us, it gives you hope for tomorrow. It really does.
Thank you. You know, thank you so much, because it is so true. The courage every day that Black Lives Matters, and, you know, ordinary people making extremely difference, really creating difference in this world because it's needed into our community. So thank you for that. Hawa, do you want me to read over the questions or that question, or are you good to go?
I think I'm okay.
All right.
I was like nodding and just and I feel like we're all in a living room right now, just having a chat. So the only thing missing is some snacks.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
We need some of your baking.
I'll bake for you, all of you, anytime. But I read that resonated for me too. And, you know, one of the things that I always share, especially with one of the things I'll say is the kind of organizing that's happening now is maybe some of the most sophisticated I've ever seen in my lifetime. It's incredibly sophisticated. People are not protests are not accidental. For anybody who has never been to a protest or helped organize a protest, protests are not accidental things that just spring up. And COVID and a global pandemic, people making sure that others are safe during protests, there's a tremendous amount of work and energy and thoughtfulness and care that goes into some of these organizing spaces, including protests. And, you know, as a young student, as many previously, right, as many people as a young person, I always had this sense that, you know, being out on the street is the right thing to do. I got to get out there. I've got to do something. And it took me quite a long time to understand that people are moving the needle in a variety of different ways. And all of those things have to work together in order for us to impact some kind of change. So in order for legislation to be tabled, you need pressure. And that kind of pressure from the form of protest is actually incredibly powerful so that other people can work at drafting and potentially tabling important legislation, right? These two things don't happen separate from one another. Mm-hmm. And I say this because there's this idea that can you change from the inside? Do you have to be on the outside to change? And I think those kinds of dynamics don't particularly suit people who live at the margins, because you don't often have the luxury to choose. Am I on the inside? Am I on the outside? You're kind of just doing what is most pressing for you and for those that you love at the moment that it's happening. So if it means protesting out in the streets, if it means, working within an organization to change the pay, the lowest paid worker to $20 an hour, all of this is instrumental change. You know, if you work in an HR department and you can shift something, if you happen to be very good friends with the CEO, and you can have a conversation that might change something for other staff members. All of this matters in the course of the work that we do. And so I've always had the ethos that as long as I'm changing the conditions for the next person coming after me, I've done something. I've done organizing, I've effected some kind of change. And as long as I leave my position and the person coming into this job is going to have an easier time than I did, I'm good. I've done okay today. I don't need to do anything more. And I can give an example. When I finished my master's degree, many people don't know, I never did an undergraduate degree. I got into an undergraduate program. I had a really difficult time at McGill. It was incredibly racist. The teachers that I was met with were not interested in supporting me. I was at Canada's version of an Ivy League school with kids who were coming in, parents were paying their tuition, blanket, had rented them these places to live. And I came in, nobody in my family had ever done post-secondary before. I had moved across the country and I had moved into this space and lived with other people. So I was learning things all by myself for the first time. And it was a really hard experience. And I ended up dropping out of school and leaving school. But I had a choice, right? I made a decision in the moment, which was I could choose to stay, but who I'll be at the end of this is going to be radically different than who I am right now. And I don't feel much like changing. Like, I don't think these folks have anything to offer me. I liked what I was doing before. I like my family. I like my friends. And so I chose to go work and go into the workforce. And so when I applied to do my master's program, I argued that my work experience was the equivalent of of an undergraduate degree. And in fact, I had more skills than a typical master's student, right? But I made a commitment. If I could get in using that argument, I would, any young person who called me to ask for help on a master's application, I would help. And anybody who told me they were doing a master's application, I would help. Because what I realized is it's a formula. None of these institutions are operating based on people's actual skills. Like, it's just how to fill out the application, how to write it. Like, you could cut and paste a bunch of stuff together, write it in the same, it's like how they teach you to write an essay, right? Intro paragraph, 3 thesis points, and a conclusion. It's the same application across all of these institutions. Per year, at the very least, there's at least 20 to 30 young people who are like, could you look over my master's application? I made that commitment like 4 years ago, and I've never stopped living up to it. And so for me, that's organizing. Every additional person who can come into a master's program that might not have had the opportunity to do it, this is my offering into the world. And how many young people have come in and are producing amazing research about Somali communities in Canada? Also a great interest and desire of mine. I just didn't want to be the only person doing it, right? Like, I wanted a bunch of other people to do it. And so, like meets like. The more you do, others then feel the same impetus to continue supporting others too. And that's ultimately my interest in politics is, what if we could show everybody how to run a campaign? What if we could show everybody who it doesn't look like a potential, I always say this, I said this to a couple of folks, I'm going to run as prime minister of this country one day. I'll absolutely run. And I bet you I'll get pretty far. But part of me choosing to say it out loud is because the more young people I can say that to, the more who might be like, well, maybe I'll run. Right? Anytime we open up space for possibility or imagination, or people can say, I can do this too, that, for me, that is the core of it. It's not just going out and protesting. It's also changing how people think about what's possible for them as well. And all of us, I know all of your work, right? We all do this in a variety of ways. We show up and we make it more possible for other people around us to show up too. Otherwise, what world would we live in, right?
Thank you. To see this passion, to see, how we helping each other, that's community. As you said, that's organizing, that's helping, that's coming. It's our lived experience is what really, make us who we are and continue to give to our community. So thank you. I will pass it on to Kike now. She has some questions as we go into the next phrase.
So I see that we're coming to the last minutes of our hour together. And I kind of wanted to put a number of different questions together. You've already started to begin to answer them in different ways, but I wanted to just hear you elaborate a little bit more. There's so much going on right now. Things that we're hearing students talk about: jobs, mental health, affordable housing, tuition, lack of supports. We feel that, sometimes we feel the government is not listening to us. We're not getting through. For a lot of my students, they feel overwhelmed, and yet they are also inspired, just as you have been, by all of these movements that are out there. People do tend to think that, wow, these are really sophisticated people who've been in it forever, just as you were alluding to. But Jill, you started saying, there's no formula, there's no book that you pull out and it gives you the instructions, and that you can start where you are. So I wanted to both of you to just speak a little bit more about how overwhelming this time feels, how people can feel like they have some sort of power and agency to do something within their spheres of where they are. And what would you advise students who want to get more involved and feel like they maybe don't have the kinds of parents and communities that your parents and family brought you into? A lot of my students are like, they're taking the course, they're interested, right? But they're not connected to any group. They're not connected to their student union. They're not connected to any group, and they're feeling isolated. What would you say to those students in particular at this critical juncture in conclusion?
And cut me off if I go too long. I think, first of all, acknowledging the feeling of overwhelmness, anxiety that many of us are feeling the impacts that's having on our mental health, that is okay. Like, it is okay to name that and to claim that, you do not have to be always positive or bushy-tailed or bright-eyed to be an activist, to be an advocate, to care about something that you've lived through, to want to see change. You don't. What you do need is a support system. And, that support system may not be your family. I'm thinking of many, of my friends and loved ones and chosen family members in queer and trans communities, Black queer and trans communities, racialized, whatnot, two-spirited, where, quite frankly, your biological family may or may not be in the picture, right? But there are people out there who you can connect with. Have a conversation, just a conversation with a friend, an acquaintance. Ask them what they're interested in. Tell them what you're interested in. A movement can start with one, it can start with two. It doesn't have to always start with 100. It doesn't always have to be the 10,000, right? So I think start small, be gentle with yourself, be realistic, admit when it's a low day. Today is a low day, I tell you. There have been some shenanigans played here at Queen's Park in the legislature today. And this is one of those days where I'm like, man, is this the right toolbox for me? And it's okay to question yourself, even as you're approaching your activism, or as you're trying to figure out who you are and what kind of a step forward you're going to be able to take, or a step in the back, because you don't always have to be a front-facing leader either. If you ask me, the strongest ones are sometimes the person at the back. It's sort of like the saying about listening. The smartest person isn't always the loudest person in the room. In fact, it rarely is, I also want to say very clearly to students that are listening, do not be afraid to contact your elected officials. As a kid, I'd never been to this building. I didn't know, A from B, right? That is changing today. That is changing because, more kids are coming to Queen's Park. I mean, pre-COVID, more kids are showing up at City Hall. You know what I'm saying? That is an important part of your rights, your right to democracy, your right to having a voice. Reach out to your elected officials, even if you're a teenager, even if you're a young student in post-secondary, even if you're a student older in life, back in post-secondary. Reach out, draw up petitions, get MPPs like myself to table them so your voice can be heard. Show up how you can, but also make time for self-care. That is something that most people that are in this world of politics, of social justice, of, decolonized education, maybe most of us on this call, self-care is so low on the priority list. And that doesn't allow us to revitalize to go on for the next day. And I'm giving you this advice. I don't always take my advice. I need to take my advice better, but don't give up. Start small, start where you're at. Have a conversation, figure out a plan, reach out to people like those on the call today or others that you may know or not know. Because let's face it, because of systemic discrimination, we don't always have necessarily the same contact to our networks. Our networks exist. Don't make anyone tell you that there aren't Black leaders and executives and this and that. They're there, but we just don't always know how to navigate the channels. But ask for help. Ask for help. It is out there and we do respond. People do respond and they do see you, like how Hawa's teacher saw her and invited her to come up at the front of the class and lead the class. There are people out there who will see you, right? And will invite you to lead, just like I was invited to run. I didn't see myself here, just like Hawa was invited to run. Hawa, in fact, we met at Canadian Women's Foundation. And I don't know if you remember, but I told you to. I was like, you know what? Have you ever thought of politics? Right? And that's the thing. We see each other and, show love. And that's how you build that trust, because you can't organize, you can't mobilize if there's no trust in the folks that you're mobilizing and organizing with.
Wow, powerful.
I mean, I think I would just add one thing. Figure out where the urgency is coming from. Figure out, because if the urgency is if you think the urgency is about the state of the world and the people who have been impacted by the most terrible things are working on those things, right? And have agency and are moving the needle on those things. There's tons of people organizing and mobilizing and moving. We need more, but the urgency that sometimes I think students feel it's happening within them and isn't necessarily always reflective of the level of urgency that might be happening out in the world. And you can't respond to the world's urgency until you feel grounded. You need to be eating, you need to be sleeping, you need to finish some of the priorities that are on your list of things. You need to make sure your family members are good. You need to make sure you can afford your housing. Like, there are urgent things that are happening for students who don't have a lot of places. Like the urgencies that are happening for students are so overwhelming sometimes that one of the ways that they resolve it is by focusing on the urgency that's happening outside. And it's not to say that you can't focus on both, but you have to resolve the urgency for you first. You have to be a bit more stable. You have to have the foundation and reach out. And beyond just reach out, the only way you can organize is with other people. You can't canvass by yourself. If you want to be a politician, you can't write a bill by yourself. Like, there's nothing you're doing on your own. You're always, some people have. You should be working with others. And the reason I always say that is because other people bring new insights and thinking to your work that just takes it to another place. And so if you're isolated and alone, look for it. There's tons of mutual aid initiatives that have sprung up across the city. I have like a love-hate relationship with mutual aid. I love it because I'm like, this is called community work and people have done it for generations and thousands of centuries. And then I love it because I'm like, oh, what a great place for students to go to begin the process of building long-term relationships. And for communities to get some support who need it. And so I say this to say there's hundreds of mutual aid networks that have sprung up in neighborhoods. Such a quick, kind of easy way to link into a group of people. And the only work is to support each other, right? Like, that is the kind of organizing. It's just to pick up somebody's mail. If you're going to go to the grocery store, buy a couple extra bananas for the neighbor who can't leave, right? It's low barrier, really easy entry. And I mean, again, part of the challenge for students, I think, is they're pushing up against these really difficult systems. And what I would say too is have patience. It takes generations sometimes for things to change. And I know we don't like that it takes generations. I certainly don't enjoy that it takes generations. There are people who have spent those generations waiting and pushing. Like, I always remind people of Angela Davis. What must it have been like to be talking about abolition at a time when people would be jailed for talking about abolition? And she was still alive to be a part of a protest where people had signs up that said, abolish the police. Like, I cannot imagine what that must have felt like for her 40, 50 years after she had been imprisoned for saying the exact same thing. And so let's not also forget history and the people in this city, in this country, who have been working for a very long time to do work that some of us are only just beginning. We have to learn from what it is that they've done, and we can rely on them to guide us into another way of being as well. So those, I mean, in addition to some of the things Jill said, I think those would be the only pieces that I would add. And it's possible. Like, I think we forget that little bit of hope. You know, Miriam Makamba says hope is a discipline. It's not an aspirational, airy-fairy thing that you jump into. Like, you've got to work at cultivating hope, but you have to believe it's possible, or you kind of get defeated during the whole process. So it's possible. I think it's possible anyway.
Wow.
Prime Minister.
Thank you so much. This has been really a great conversation. For two people who don't call themselves organizers and claim to have just fallen into leadership, you have provided amazing examples and models for all of us to follow. You've given us such great, concrete, practical advice that we can take up right away. You've showed us how you've been inspired and taught by your own elders, and how you've transmitted that wisdom and that knowledge and that energy and that care and that love to all generations. And you've shown us what is possible, that we don't have to start knowing everything, and that we can start right where we are and reach out to the people who are around us with the things that move us, that we're passionate about. And that it's important to, when we do pick up effective tools or knowledge, to pass it on and create more possibilities for others. So I want to thank both of you so much for a really enriching conversation. And I'm going to turn it over to Maddie, the president of CESAR, to close us out. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you again so much, Carol. And thank you, Kike, for organizing this conversation for us. And to Hawa, Mire, and Jill Andrews as well, for all your amazing work and your contributions, and for sharing lessons with us. This was really a masterclass, I think, on strong principled organizing and sharing tools, as you put it, Jill, in politics and in education and in community, and how organizers as well can take care of themselves and support others. And I think you provided us all with a bit of hope. Our student union, CESAR, works with students organizing around making our university better. As Jill said, reach out to your elected politicians, and for folks watching this panel who are CESAR members looking for more opportunities to get involved in organizing on campus, please email our VP Equity and Campaigns at vp.equity@mycesar.ca. Or if you're interested in planning amazing online events like this one that Carol organized, please email events@mycesar.ca. Stay tuned as well into our social media and our newsletter to find out about our upcoming events, including Indigenous History Month and Pride programming. If you're a queer student looking to help plan our Pride programming, please join us on our committee by emailing events@mycesar.ca. And so I wanted to say thank you again so much, Carol, for organizing this and for all of the events you've organized and services you've delivered for our students. Thank you so much to folks for coming to watch this conversation, and stay connected to your Students' Union, and take care.